The splash echoed across Willowbrook Lake like a gunshot, followed by gasps and the frantic clicking of phone cameras. 12-year-old Layla Martinez watched in horror from the wooden dock as her custom purple wheelchair disappeared beneath the murky water, bubbles marking its descent into the depths. The woman who had just hurled it there stood breathing heavily, her manicured hands still outstretched, her face twisted with satisfaction and rage. "Cripples don't belong in public spaces," Patricia Whitmore shrieked, her voice carrying across the peaceful afternoon air like broken glass. "This is a family community." Layla's heart hammered against her ribs as she sat stranded on the dock, her legs useless beneath her, her only means of mobility now resting somewhere in 12 feet of lake water. The warm August sun that had felt so pleasant moments before now seemed to scorch her skin as she realized the gravity of her situation. Her mother wouldn't be back from the grocery store for another hour. Her phone was in the wheelchair's side pouch, now submerged and ruined. Just minutes earlier, Layla had been lost in the pages of The Secret Garden, her favorite spot by the water, offering the perfect combination of shade from the old oak tree and gentle breeze off the lake. She came here every day after her homeschool lessons, wheeling herself down the paved path that her father had fought the Homeowners Association to install 3 years ago. It had been a battle then, with Patricia Whitmore leading the opposition, claiming that special accommodations would set a dangerous precedent and decrease property values. Now, Patricia stood there in her pristine white tennis outfit, her salon-perfect blonde hair barely disturbed by her violent outburst, watching Layla with cold blue eyes that held no trace of remorse. Behind her, a small crowd had gathered, some pulling out phones to record, others standing frozen in shock at what they had just witnessed. "You can't just leave her there," called out Mrs. Chen from the nearby jogging path, her voice shaking with indignation. She started toward the dock, but Patricia wheeled around to face her. "Mind your own business. Helen, this child has been disrupting the peace of this community for too long, always wheeling around, making noise, being an eyesore. Well, not anymore." Layla felt tears burning her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had learned long ago not to let people like Patricia see her cry. Instead, she focused on the problem at hand. The dock extended about 20 feet into the lake, and while she could pull herself along using her arms, getting back to shore and then home would be nearly impossible without her chair. "Please," Layla said, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her. "That wheelchair cost $8,000. My family saved for 2 years to buy it." Patricia's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Then maybe your family should have thought about that before moving into a community where you don't belong. This is Willowbrook Estates, not some charity case housing project." The cruelty in Patricia's words hit Layla like a physical blow. She had lived in Willowbrook Estates her entire life. Her parents, both nurses at the local hospital, had bought their modest 3-bedroom home when Layla was just a baby, before the car accident that left her paralyzed from the waist down at age 7. This was her neighborhood, her community, her home. Marcus Thompson, a teenager from the next street over, stepped forward with his phone held high. "Lady, you're insane. I'm calling the police right now." "You'll do no such thing," Patricia snapped, reaching for his phone. But Marcus was quick, stepping back and continuing to record as Patricia's face grew red with fury. "Ma'am, step back," Marcus said firmly. "You just committed assault against a disabled child. This is all being recorded, and it's going straight to social media." Patricia's eyes widened as she realized the implications of what she had done. Around the lake, more people had stopped to watch, drawn by the commotion. Several were now filming, their phones capturing every word of her tirade. "Delete that video immediately," Patricia demanded, her voice rising to a shriek. "I am the president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I have authority here." "You have authority to throw disabled kids' wheelchairs in lakes?" asked Sarah Mitchell, a young mother who had been pushing her toddler in a stroller. "What kind of monster are you?" Layla watched the confrontation unfold around her, feeling surreal and detached. Part of her wanted to defend herself, to tell Patricia exactly what she thought of her and her twisted sense of community values. But another part of her, the part that had learned to navigate the world as a disabled person, knew that staying calm and letting Patricia reveal her true nature was the better strategy. "I want everyone to hear this clearly," Layla said, her voice carrying despite its softness. "Mrs. Whitmore just told me that disabled people don't belong in public spaces. She destroyed my mobility aid and left me stranded. This is not about community standards or property values. This is about hate." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Patricia's face went from red to purple, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "How dare you? I am not a hateful person. I simply believe in maintaining the standards that make this community desirable. Your constant presence here, with that contraption, sends the wrong message about the kind of neighborhood this is." "What message is that, exactly?" asked Dr. Rodriguez, an elderly man who lived 2 streets over. He had been walking his dog when the commotion started, and now stood with his arms crossed, staring at Patricia with disgust. Patricia seemed to realize she was digging herself deeper, but her anger had carried her past the point of rational thought. "It says we don't maintain proper standards. It says we allow just anyone to come here and wheel around wherever they please, disrupting the aesthetic we've worked so hard to create." "The aesthetic of what ableism?" Sarah Mitchell shot back. "My daughter goes to school with Layla. She's one of the kindest, smartest kids in their grade. And you just threw her wheelchair in a lake because you think disabled people are an eyesore." By now, nearly 24 people had gathered around the scene. Some were neighbors Layla recognized. Others were joggers and dog walkers who had been using the public trails around the lake. All of them looked horrified by what they had witnessed. Marcus Thompson was still recording, making sure to capture not just Patricia's words, but also the reactions of the crowd. "This is going viral," he said quietly to his friend Jamie, who had joined him. "This lady just destroyed her whole life in 5 minutes." Meanwhile, Layla was calculating her options. She could pull herself along the dock using the railings, but getting from the dock to the paved path would require crawling across rough gravel that would shred her hands and knees. Her leg braces, designed to work with her wheelchair, would be useless for this kind of movement. "I'll help you," said Mrs. Chen, approaching the dock. "Let me call my husband to bring our van. We can get you home safely." "Don't you dare help her," Patricia screamed, stepping between Mrs. Chen and the dock. "This is HOA property, and I am ordering you to leave immediately." "Actually, this is public property," Dr. Rodriguez said calmly. "The lake and surrounding paths are maintained by the city, not the HOA. You have no authority here, Patricia. And even if you did, what you just did is criminal." Patricia's face crumpled as the reality of her situation began to sink in. She looked around at the circle of hostile faces, at the phone still recording her every word, at Layla sitting stranded on the dock like a living testament to her cruelty. I was just trying to protect our community," she said weakly. "Property values have been declining, and the board members have been complaining about the image we're projecting. "So you decided to attack a child?" asked Sarah Mitchell. "You destroyed an $8,000 piece of medical equipment because you think disabled people hurt your property values." Layla watched Patricia's face cycle through emotions: rage, panic, desperate rationalization. She had seen this before from people who couldn't accept that their prejudice had been exposed. They always tried to backtrack, to make it about something else, anything else, rather than confront their own bigotry. "It's not about her being disabled," Patricia said, her voice taking on a wheedling tone. "It's about the disruption to our peaceful community. The noise, the constant presence." "What noise?" Layla asked quietly. "I read books. I don't even listen to music out loud." Patricia had no answer for that. The truth was that Layla was one of the quietest, most respectful users of the public spaces around Willowbrook Lake. She never left trash, never disturbed other visitors, never even spoke loudly on her phone. Her only crime was existing in a space that Patricia had decided should be reserved for people she deemed worthy. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the tension of the moment. Someone had called the police despite Patricia's protests. As the squad car pulled up, Patricia seemed to shrink into herself, finally understanding that she could not talk or threaten her way out of what she had done. Officer Janet Sterling emerged from the patrol car with a grim expression. She had been a cop for 15 years and had seen plenty of cruelty, but something about the scene before her, a disabled child stranded on a dock while adults argued around her, struck her as particularly heinous. "What's the situation here?" Officer Sterling asked, her hand resting on her radio. Multiple voices started talking at once, but Marcus Thompson stepped forward with his phone. "Officer, I have the whole thing recorded. This woman threw that girl's wheelchair into the lake and said disabled people don't belong in public." Officer Sterling looked from the phone to Patricia to Layla, her expression growing colder by the second. "Ma'am, did you destroy this child's mobility device?" Patricia's lawyer instincts, honed from her work as a real estate attorney, finally kicked in. "I'm not saying anything without my attorney present." "That's your right," Officer Sterling said. "But I have multiple witnesses and video evidence. You're under arrest for destruction of property and assault." She turned to Layla. "Sweetie, are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" Layla shook her head. "I'm okay physically, but I can't get home without my chair." "We'll figure that out," Officer Sterling said gently. She began reading Patricia her rights as she cuffed her, ignoring the woman's protests about her standing in the community and demands to speak to the police chief. As Patricia was led away, the crowd began to disperse slowly, many still shaking their heads in disbelief. Mrs. Chen had called her husband, who arrived with their van and a portable ramp they kept for their own elderly mother. With gentle efficiency, they helped Layla off the dock and into their vehicle. "Thank you," Layla said quietly as they drove toward her house. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been there." "Honey, no one deserves to be treated like that," Mrs. Chen said, her voice thick with emotion. "That woman is sick. There's something deeply wrong with her." As they pulled into Layla's driveway, her mother's car was just arriving from the grocery store. Maria Martinez took one look at her daughter being helped out of a neighbor's van and knew immediately that something was wrong. "Mija, what happened? Where's your chair?" Layla burst into tears then, all the composure she had maintained during the confrontation finally cracking. As Mrs. Chen explained what had happened, Maria's face went through the same cycle of emotions the crowd at the lake had experienced: disbelief, shock, and finally, burning rage. "She threw your wheelchair in the lake," Maria's voice was barely controlled. Because she thinks you don't belong in public? Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Thompson was uploading his video to every social media platform he could think of. He titled it simply, HOA Karen throws disabled girl's wheelchair in lake, says cripples don't belong in public. Within an hour, the video had been shared hundreds of times. Within 6 hours, it had gone viral. The footage was devastating in its clarity. There was Patricia in her pristine tennis outfit, hurling the purple wheelchair into the water with shocking violence. There was her voice, crystal clear in the recording, spewing hatred about disabled people not belonging in public spaces. There was Layla, 12 years old and stranded, responding to cruelty with grace and dignity that made the contrast even more stark. Comments poured in from around the world. Disability rights advocates shared the video with expressions of outrage. Parents of disabled children wrote heartbreaking messages about their own experiences with discrimination. Even people with no direct connection to disability issues were shocked by the blatant cruelty of the act. Among those who saw the video was David Chen, a prominent disability rights attorney who had been following accessibility issues in suburban communities. He immediately recognized the location Willowbrook Estates had been on his radar for months due to complaints about HOA discrimination against residents with disabilities. David spent the evening researching Patricia Whitmore and discovered a pattern that made his blood boil. As HOA president, she had systematically opposed every accessibility improvement in the community. She had fought the installation of ramps, blocked requests for accessible parking spaces, and even objected to residents installing grab bars on their own property, claiming they were aesthetic violations. But it went deeper than that. David found email chains where Patricia referred to disabled residents as problems and burdens. He found meeting minutes where she argued that attracting disabled residents would hurt property values. Most damning of all, he found a recorded phone call where Patricia told another board member that she was working to clean up the community by making life difficult for residents with disabilities. The next morning, David called the Martinez family. Maria answered the phone with exhaustion in her voice. She had spent the night fielding calls from reporters and trying to explain to Layla's younger brother why his sister's wheelchair was at the bottom of a lake. Mrs. Martinez, my name is David Chen. I'm a disability rights attorney, and I saw what happened to your daughter yesterday. I'd like to help. Maria was skeptical at first. The family had dealt with lawyers before during the initial fight to get accessibility improvements in their neighborhood, and the experience had been frustrating and expensive. But as David explained what he had uncovered about Patricia Whitmore's pattern of discrimination, Maria realized this was bigger than just one cruel incident. You're saying she's been targeting disabled residents for years? I'm saying she's been waging a systematic campaign to drive disabled people out of your community. David replied, what happened to Layla wasn't a moment of anger. It was the culmination of years of escalating hatred. That afternoon, David met with the Martinez family in their living room. Layla was using a borrowed wheelchair from the hospital where her parents worked, but it was too big and uncomfortable, making even simple movements difficult. The contrast between her obvious discomfort and her determined dignity struck David immediately. Layla, I want you to know that what happened to you was not just wrong. It was illegal. David said gently, Mrs. Whitmore committed several crimes, and I believe we can hold her accountable, not just for destroying your wheelchair, but for a pattern of hate-based discrimination. What's a hate crime? Layla asked. She had heard the term mentioned on the news coverage of the incident, but wasn't entirely sure what it meant. It's when someone commits a crime against you because of who you are, your race, religion, disability status, or other protected characteristics. David explained, "The law recognizes that crimes motivated by hate cause extra harm to both the victim and the community." Over the next several days, the video continued to spread across social media. National news outlets picked up the story, interviewing disability rights experts who placed Patricia's actions in the context of widespread discrimination against disabled people. The Today Show ran a segment on accessibility in HOA communities. CNN interviewed Layla via video call, where she impressed viewers with her articulate responses to questions about the incident. "I think Mrs. Whitmore represents how a lot of people feel about disabled people," Layla said during the CNN interview. "They want us to be grateful, and quiet, and invisible. When we dare to exist in the same spaces they use, they get angry. But public spaces belong to all of us." The attention brought both support and additional harassment. The Martinez family received hundreds of messages of support, including offers to replace Layla's wheelchair and donations to help with legal expenses. But they also received ugly messages from people who agreed with Patricia's actions, calling Layla's family freeloaders, and worse. Meanwhile, Patricia Whitmore was released on bail, but found herself completely ostracized from the community she had claimed to protect. HOA board members distanced themselves from her statements, claiming they had no knowledge of her discriminatory views. Her law firm placed her on administrative leave, pending the outcome of criminal charges. Even her country club suspended her membership. The preliminary hearing drew national media attention. Willowbrook's small courthouse was surrounded by news vans and protesters, both for and against Patricia. The disability rights community had organized a large demonstration, with hundreds of people in wheelchairs, with service dogs, with visible and invisible disabilities, showing solidarity with Layla. Patricia arrived with her high-powered legal team, but their strategy of portraying the incident as a misunderstanding fell apart quickly when prosecutors played Marcus Thompson's video for the court. There was no misunderstanding the hatred in Patricia's voice as she screamed about cripples not belonging in public. There was no ambiguity in her violent destruction of Layla's mobility device. But the prosecution had more than just the video. David Chen had provided them with years of documentation showing Patricia's pattern of discrimination. Email chains, meeting recordings, testimony from other disabled residents who had been harassed by Patricia. It painted a picture of systematic hatred that transformed a simple assault case into something much more serious. "Your Honor," Prosecutor Amanda Walsh said during her opening statement, "this was not an isolated incident. This was the culmination of a years-long campaign of intimidation and discrimination against disabled residents of Willowbrook Estates. The defendant didn't just destroy a child's wheelchair. She attempted to destroy a child's sense of belonging in her own community." Patricia's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had been under stress from her HOA duties and had simply snapped. He painted her as a pillar of the community who had made one terrible mistake. But that narrative crumbled when the prosecution called witness after witness who described Patricia's pattern of harassment. Margaret Foster, an elderly woman who used a walker, testified that Patricia had repeatedly complained about her slow movement on community sidewalks and had suggested she consider moving somewhere more suitable for her limitations. James Park, a veteran who had lost his leg in Afghanistan, described how Patricia had blocked his request to install a ramp at his own front door, calling it an eyesore that would hurt everyone's property values. Most powerfully, 8-year-old Tyler Brooks testified via video link about how Patricia had banned him from the community playground because his autism sometimes caused him to make loud noises that she claimed were disturbing other families. When Layla took the stand, the courtroom was completely silent. Even reporters stopped typing to listen as she described the incident in her own words. "I wasn't bothering anyone," she said quietly. "I was just reading my book like I do every day." Mrs. Whitmore came over and started yelling at me about how I didn't belong there. When I tried to explain that I live in the neighborhood, she got even angrier. She said I was an eyesore and that families didn't want to see me when they were trying to enjoy their afternoon. "How did that make you feel?" Prosecutor Walsh asked gently. Layla was quiet for a long moment. "It made me feel like I wasn't human. Like because I use a wheelchair. I don't deserve to exist in the same world as everyone else. But then I realized that the problem wasn't with me. The problem was with someone who could look at a kid reading a book and see something worth destroying." Patricia's defense attorney made the mistake of cross-examining Layla aggressively, trying to suggest that she had been provocative in her responses to Patricia's complaints. The strategy backfired spectacularly, as Layla calmly explained that her only provocation had been existing in a public space while disabled. "Sir, I was reading The Secret Garden," Layla said with the kind of composure that made adults in the courtroom ashamed of their own emotional reactions. "I don't think Charles Dickens wrote anything particularly provocative about friendship and gardens." The laughter that rippled through the courtroom was quickly silenced by the judge. But the damage to Patricia's defense was clear. Here was a 12-year-old girl who had been brutally attacked for reading a book, responding to hostile questioning with grace and intelligence that highlighted the absurdity of trying to blame her for Patricia's actions. When the prosecution called Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a psychologist who specialized in hate crimes, her testimony provided crucial context for understanding Patricia's actions. Disability-based hate crimes often stem from deep-seated beliefs that disabled people are less valuable members of society. Dr. Martinez explained, "The perpetrator sees the disabled person's presence in public spaces as inappropriate or threatening to their vision of how society should look. The crime isn't just about the immediate victim. It's about sending a message to an entire community that they don't belong." The expert testimony helped the jury understand that Patricia's actions weren't just personal cruelty, but part of a broader pattern of discrimination that disabled people face every day. The decision to throw Layla's wheelchair in the lake wasn't spontaneous anger. It was calculated intimidation designed to drive her away from public spaces. Patricia's testimony in her own defense was a disaster. Her legal team had clearly tried to prepare her to show remorse and take responsibility. But her fundamental inability to see disabled people as equal human beings came through in every answer. "I never intended to hurt anyone," she said, but when pressed about her specific statements about cripples not belonging in public, she became defensive and evasive. "I was using language that reflected my frustration with the situation," she said. "I felt that the community standards we had worked so hard to establish were being undermined." "What community standards allow you to throw a child's mobility device in a lake?" Prosecutor Walsh asked. I wasn't thinking clearly. The stress of my position, the complaints from other residents about the changes to our neighborhood character." "What changes to your neighborhood character?" "The presence of disabled people." Patricia's pause was damning. "The changes to the aesthetic we had cultivated, and disabled people hurt that aesthetic." Another pause. "I believe that certain accommodations can impact the visual appeal of a community." The prosecution had expertly led Patricia into admitting that her actions were based on prejudice against disabled people, not any legitimate community concern. Her own words condemned her more effectively than any evidence the prosecution could have presented. During closing arguments, Prosecutor Walsh played the video of the incident one more time, letting Patricia's own voice fill the courtroom. "Cripples don't belong in public spaces. This is a family community." "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Walsh said, "the defendant wants you to believe this was a moment of poor judgment. But you've heard testimony about years of harassment. You've seen emails where she refers to disabled residents as problems to be solved. You've heard her own words on this witness stand, where she still cannot bring herself to acknowledge that disabled people have the same right to public spaces as anyone else." She gestured toward Layla, who sat in the front row with her parents, her new wheelchair donated by a medical equipment company after the story went viral, a stark reminder of what Patricia had destroyed. This 12-year-old girl was reading a book by a lake. She was harming no one, bothering no one, disrupting nothing. The defendant saw her and felt such hatred, such disgust at the sight of a disabled child existing in public, that she destroyed an $8,000 piece of medical equipment and left that child stranded and helpless. Walsh's voice grew stronger as she continued. "This is not just assault. This is not just destruction of property. This is a hate crime, designed to terrorize not just Layla Martinez, but every disabled person who might dare to believe they have the right to exist in public spaces alongside everyone else." Patricia's defense attorney made a final plea for leniency, arguing that his client had already suffered enough through public humiliation and career destruction. But his words rang hollow in the face of the evidence presented over the previous week. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict. When the forewoman stood to read their decision, the packed courtroom fell silent. On the charge of assault in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of destruction of property, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of hate crime enhancement, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted in cheers from the disability rights advocates who had followed the case, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Patricia slumped in her chair, finally understanding that her actions had consequences she could not escape through privilege or connections. At sentencing 2 weeks later, Judge Patricia Williams delivered a statement that would be quoted in disability rights literature for years to come. "Mrs. Whitmore, you had every advantage in life. You had education, wealth, social standing, and professional success. You used those advantages not to build up your community, but to tear down its most vulnerable members. You looked at a 12-year-old girl reading a book and saw an enemy to be destroyed." The judge's voice grew stern as she continued, "Hate crimes aren't just attacks on individuals. They're attacks on the values that hold our society together. When you threw that wheelchair into the lake, you weren't just hurting Layla Martinez. You were telling every disabled person in America that their right to exist in public spaces depends on the approval of people like you." Patricia was sentenced to 2 years in prison, followed by 3 years of probation with mandatory community service at disability rights organizations. She was also ordered to pay restitution for Layla's wheelchair and therapy costs, plus a substantial fine that would be donated to accessibility advocacy groups. But the consequences extended far beyond Patricia's personal punishment. The HOA was sued by the Department of Justice for systematic discrimination against disabled residents, resulting in a consent decree that required comprehensive accessibility improvements throughout Willowbrook Estates. The community was ordered to install curb cuts, accessible parking spaces, and playground equipment that children with disabilities could use. More importantly, the case sparked national conversations about disability rights and inclusion. Schools began teaching about disability history alongside other civil rights movements. Corporations implemented better accessibility training for their employees. Local governments reviewed their own policies to ensure they weren't inadvertently discriminating against disabled residents. Layla became an unexpected advocate for disability rights, speaking at conferences and schools about her experience. But she never let the attention change who she was, fundamentally a kid who loved to read books by the water's edge. 6 months after the trial, Layla returned to her favorite spot by Willowbrook Lake. The community had installed a beautiful, accessible deck where the old dock had been, with smooth surfaces for wheelchairs and benches at various heights for people with different mobility needs. A small plaque near the entrance read, "Layla's Landing, a space for all community members to enjoy the peace and beauty of nature." As Layla settled into her reading spot with a new book, she noticed several other families with disabled children using the space. A little boy with cerebral palsy was feeding ducks with his sister. A teenage girl with Down syndrome was sketching the lake scene in her art pad. An elderly man in a wheelchair was playing chess with his grandson on one of the new accessible tables. Mrs. Chen approached with her usual afternoon walk, stopping to say hello to Layla, as she had every day since the incident. "How's the new book?" Mrs. Chen asked. "It's about a girl who changes her whole community," Layla replied with a smile. "It's pretty good so far." As the sun began to set over Willowbrook Lake, casting golden reflections across the water, Layla felt a deep sense of peace. Not because her battle was over. She knew there would always be people like Patricia Whitmore, who saw disabled people as problems to be solved rather than community members to be welcomed. But because she had learned something important, when you respond to hatred with dignity, when you refuse to be made invisible, when you insist on your right to exist in the world, you can change more than just your own circumstances. You can change the world itself. The wheelchair that Patricia had thrown into the lake had been recovered by divers during the investigation, its purple frame now rusted and its electronics destroyed beyond repair. Layla had asked to keep it, and it now sat in her bedroom as a reminder not of the cruelty she had experienced, but of the strength she had discovered within herself and the community that had rallied to support her. In the end, Patricia Whitmore had been right about one thing. Layla Martinez had changed the character of Willowbrook Estates. But she had changed it for the better, transforming it from a community that merely tolerated disabled residents into one that actively welcomed and included them. The woman who had tried to make her invisible had instead made her a beacon of hope for disabled people everywhere. As darkness fell over the lake, and Layla packed up her book to head home, she reflected on how much had changed since that terrible afternoon. Patricia was serving her prison sentence. The community was more accessible than ever before, and disabled people throughout the country had been inspired by her story to demand their own rights to public spaces. But perhaps most importantly, a 12-year-old girl had learned that she possessed a power she never knew she had the power to transform hatred into hope, exclusion into inclusion, and injustice into a movement for change. And that power, unlike wheelchairs or walkways or any physical accommodation, could never be taken away or thrown into any lake. The next morning brought news that Patricia Whitmore's conviction had been upheld on appeal, cementing the legal precedent that would protect future victims of disability-based hate crimes. Layla read the news while eating breakfast, then packed her book bag and headed out to her favorite reading spot. Ready for another day in the community she had helped to transform, not through anger or revenge, but through the simple revolutionary act of refusing to be made invisible.